Good afternoon, good evening. We have a connection from Kinshasa, so I was trying to figure out what time it was there. It's a pleasure to see all of you. We have good level of attendance, but also we have many colleagues online. My name is Frank Bousquet. I'm Deputy Director at the IMF of the Institute of Capacity Development, coordinating the engagement of the IMF in fragile and conflict-affected states. And I'm very pleased to be here in a panel which is jointly organized between the two Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, as part of the Fragility Forum. This is the most important session of the entire Fragility Forum. There has been some laugh in this room, but it's actually very serious. So the whole nexus between fragility, political instability, and macroeconomic fundamentals is actually quite important. The whole point that you are going to hear first through two presentations from the IMF and from the World Bank, I will come back to the presenters, is really to try to see the complex relation between the different drivers and root cause of fragility. And it's not as linear as we may think. It's a little bit more complex, and there are actually some key takeaway. So here is the way we're going to proceed. First, we're going to have a presentation from Aliona. Aliona Botari is going to have a presentation of 10 minutes of a paper that was just recently released, an IMF working paper, which is entitled Political Fragility, Coup d'etat and Their Drivers. Aliona, some colleagues may know her. She's mission chief for Gabon, but also a lot of experience on fragile and conflict-affected states, and she's division chief in the IMF African department. Then we turn to Shadi Wabib. I heard, Shadi, we could not see you, but you are somewhere. We can see you. This is fantastic. I had the pleasure of interacting with Shadi when I was acting country director in Kinshasa in DRC. He was the sector lead on EFI and did a fantastic job. But today is going to come with another hat. Shadi has been working a lot on public experiential review, human capital. I still remember his work on the mining sector and the reform of the mining sector in DRC. I see a smile on Shadi's face, how important this was. And Shadi will cover the interaction between terms of trade shocks, violence and growth, and the impact of security spending on growth and political risk and fragility. I also want to recognize in the room Fernando Blanco, lead economist at the World Bank. Fernando, do you want to stand up? It's important to recognize people who do work. And I think, not that Aliona and Shadi didn't do work, they did the work, but Fernando as well has been also working very hard. And I wanted to make sure there is recognition across the room, and who has played a key role on the research and also for organizing this event, next to Paul Biska, who is next to you, who has done also an excellent job in partnering with our colleagues from the World Bank. So let's go for the panelists. Shanta, I'm not sure that at the World Bank it makes sense to present. Shanta Devarajan, is part of the person I have the highest respect for. And those people who know me know that I'm not necessarily always politically correct, but I have to say I learned a lot from Shanta. I was very lucky to be in the Middle East and North Africa region at the same time than Shanta, under the leadership of Hafez Ghanem. And I have to say the whole strategic focus in MENA on focusing on social contract was very inspiring, and we worked together very closely. Now Shanta has moved on to be professor of the practice of international development at Georgetown University. He's very active. It's very difficult to catch Shanta, even more difficult than before. And he has been, as I mentioned, senior director for development economics at the World Bank, but also chief economist of MENA and South Asia regions and Human Development Network. Then Elizabeth, next to me on my right, Elizabeth Speha, who is the Assistant Secretary General for the Peace Building Support Office, PBSO, at the UN Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs. Elizabeth brings only 35 years of experience leading political development, peace building, and conflict prevention initiative at the UN. And she was previously, which is also very important in terms of experience, Secretary General, Special Representative, and Head of the UN Peacekeeping Force in Cyprus. So let's turn to Aliona. You have 10 minutes to present your paper. For those who are participating online and watching online, I would like to remind you that translation is possible on the Fragility Forums event application. And of course, we'll make sure that we keep at least 20 minutes to ask questions from the room, but also online. Aliona, thank you for being here. Over to you.
All right, so everybody can hear me? Sounds good. So thank you very much, Frank, and thank you very much to the World Bank for inviting us to talk about fragility in the macroeconomy. I will talk about the coup d'etats and their drivers. The motivation behind this work has been, of course, the surge in coups that we've all witnessed over the last 3 to 5 years, pretty much all but 2 of them in sub-Saharan Africa. But also around that time, the IMF has, Frank, you did not mention that, which I'm surprised. Frank, the IMF has started putting together its strategy for engaging with fragile and conflict-affected states. So with that came a lot of thinking about what fragility is, how we can think about it, what are the drivers of fragility, how this can be addressed, and so on. So this is a little bit the background to the work that I'm going to be talking about. The questions we will ask are what are the drivers of fragility? How do the drivers affect the probability of coups? How do these drivers change over time? Can we predict coups, and can we explain the surge of coups that we've seen in the last few years, and what are the main takeaways for policies? So let me go straight to the question: what are the main drivers of coups? We've used event studies to pretty much identify those variables that have significantly different dynamics before the coups, to see if we can identify the stressors that happen before the coups. We've also used machine learning techniques, mainly to take advantage of the ability to sift through complexity, through nonlinearities, through interactions, and so on. So very quickly, from the event study, I will only mention that the indicators that showed significant weaknesses prior to coups, significant deviation from tranquil time, so to speak, are the growth. We've seen about 1 or 2% growth, about 1 or 2 percentage points below its level during tranquil times, which is kind of like outside this 10-year window surrounding the coups. We see increases in social unrest, and we see deterioration in political stability, in part driven by government crises, constitutional changes, sometimes major changes in government, and so on. So let me share with you then directly the results from the machine learning. We've used this, as I say, to identify the top drivers of coups. Here we are reporting the top drivers for the full sample for sub-Saharan Africa, the drivers that account for about 50% of the coup probabilities during this period. I will not tell you how to read these charts. It's going to take me more than 10 minutes then, but I will tell you, I'll walk you a little bit through these drivers as I talk about how they affect the coup probabilities. So the 2 main takeaways here from this slide is that the main drivers of coups that we've identified are really structural in nature. So we call them sources of fragility. These are variables these are kind of like characteristics of the environment in which the coups happen. The variables the drivers that we see in this category are pretty much young demographics, a recent history of coups, lower incomes, lower inclusion, both economic and political, higher reliance on natural resources, weaker governance. And just the second takeaway from this slide is that the impact of these drivers is really nonlinear. In what sense? So let me randomly pick one of the account balances low foreign exchange reserves. And we have natural resource rents. When we see increases in natural resources, we see a probability of coups increasing, in part because the benefits of being in power, so to speak, make it more attractive to take power through coups. The other set of variables that we see are the policy drivers. They are a little bit less important than the previous two, the structural variables and the conjunctural drivers. The ones that come out the most significant here are usually the deterioration in the rule of law and deterioration in the fiscal position. We also have decreases in military spending as part of these policy drivers. All right, now the next takeaway is probably the most important one, is that we not only do drivers affect coup probabilities non-linearly, but they also interact with each other. The first type of interaction that I'm showing here are the interaction between stressors and sources of fragility, or in other words, between the structural drivers that I talked about and the conjunctural drivers. And this is going to be important for the main takeaways. The point, yes. Oh, sorry. Yes. So the main takeaway here is the following in terms of how this interaction works. When countries have strong structural fundamentals, in the big picture example here, we have income per capita is high, for example, as part of the structural fundamentals. When structural fundamentals are strong, the stressors do not significantly affect the coup probabilities. And that you can see from the flatness of the blue line. So the blue line is not very sensitive to the impact of the shock, in this case, the shock is the real GDP growth. However, when the structural fundamentals are weak, that makes countries more sensitive to shocks. And the weak structural fundamentals, in fact, act as double amplifiers of shocks. So I'm not going to move from the thing, but just to show you on this side of it, when you have negative stresses, negative economic shocks, such as, in this case, the GDP, in this case, growth falls. The probability of coups increases faster in countries with weaker fundamentals. Yeah, so the orange line increases much more significantly than the blue line. And importantly, the opposite is true in the case of positive shocks, or when negative shocks recede. When negative shocks recede, the probability of coups falls faster in countries with weaker fundamentals. Think fragile countries. This is going to fit into, as I said, into the main takeaway. But just to say that this kind of interaction applies both to macroeconomic shocks and to policy shocks, and their interactions with the sources of fragility. So they interact kind of like broadly the same way. And the example of the second chart is about the policy shocks. Finally, before going to the prediction part, just to say that we also have interactions among the sources of fragility. In other words, between structural drivers. So when the structural drivers can amplify each other. So if we're to think about fragile economies that have a multitude of structural weaknesses, that the amplification of these weaknesses basically make them more prone to coups. And the final set of interactions are among the stressors. When you have situations of overlapping shocks, like we all experienced, during the pandemic and the post-pandemic period with pandemic wars, food inflation, and so on, they also amplify each other. So that creates an environment that's more prone to coups. So I will skip, we can trace how different groups of drivers evolve over time, and we can see what tends to account for the probabilities of coups over different periods of time. We'll not stop there, but let me just go straight to the prediction part. How does the machine learning model do in terms of predicting coups? And I will just say that overall it has a pretty good predictive power. The chart on the right shows that it was able pretty well to predict the increase in coups over time, over the last 3-5 years. It also did pretty good in terms of predicting individual country coups. The chart on the, no, that was a chart on the left. This is a chart on the right. Shows the countries that the top 25 countries in terms of the high probability of coups. And in red are the ones that actually had coups. So out of the 10 countries that had coups over the last 5 years, the model picked 9. So except for Myanmar, 9 in terms of predicting, putting them in the top 25 countries with coup probabilities. And the final point, just to say that the model did also well in terms of picking the drivers behind the high coup probabilities. So the 2 country examples that I put here, Niger and Gabon, both had coups in 2023. Some of the drivers are in common, but just to highlight, for example, that in the case of Niger, we have conflict as part of the drivers and the spillovers from the coup in the Sahel neighbors, which are not, of course, part of the Gabon. In the case of Gabon, we have the weakening of inclusion, both political and economic inclusion, as part of the coup drivers. And voila. So in conclusion, the nature of the drivers behind political fragility and behind coups are complex and multifaceted. Some of them are more conjunctural in nature, which is destabilization of the economic, political, security environment of the country. These in the presence of structural weaknesses, these stressors and these conjunctural drivers tend to increase the probability of coups more, and weak policies also play a role. So any deterioration in fiscal policy or the governance environment also tends to add to the coup probabilities. The most important thing that I will emphasize, because the presentation was short, so there's no need to repeat many of the things. The main takeaway is that we've seen that when we have multiple structural weaknesses, i.e. we are in a situation that could be characteristic of fragile countries, they could be more vulnerable to coups when in the presence of macroeconomic shocks or in the presence of a deterioration of policies. But the converse is also true, as we saw. The economic, and for us, this was the main bottom line, that economic stabilization and stronger policies also have higher returns in fragile environments, which means that the presence of international donors, institutions, is particularly beneficial in fragile environments because of the kind of triple benefit: strengthening policies through reforms, strengthening the structural fundamentals through reforms, and providing a more stable macroeconomic environment. So the benefit of this presence is much stronger in fragile states than it is in other states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aliona, not only for summarizing in just 10 minutes the key takeaway of a paper that is actually quite important, looking at, again, zooming at the root cause of fragility. We said that the IMF or the World Bank were not paying attention to that, but also more importantly, to look at one area where I'd like to engage with Chantal later on and Elizabeth about remaining engaged. What does that mean? How important it is? Is it just a role for peace security actors? What can they do? Is it a role just for humanitarian? Do they have the funding, by the way? Or is it a role for development or financial institution? But then really what should be done? So I think you really opened the space for a very important discussion. Let me now turn to, thank you again, Aliona, to Shadi. Over to you for your presentation. Difficulty hearing. So Shadi, I don't know if you can hear us, but we cannot hear you and you are frozen. That's an hybrid session. So it happens sometimes.
You have a plan B for that?
Yes. So Fernando. And you have been introduced. So I guess colleagues are not discovering someone suddenly. So Fernando, go ahead. Shadi, you may want to try to reconnect meanwhile to be joining the discussion. Thank you, Fernando.
I'm back, actually.
It's back.
Okay, so Shadi, let's give another try. Go
Yeah,
ahead. Please.
okay, so thank you. So here we're actually presenting 5 ASAs and papers that are at the various levels of completion. So, and we are looking at 3 aspects related to the interaction between economics, macroeconomics, and fragility. We are looking at the interaction between term of trade shocks, violence, and growth. We are looking also to the positive impact of security spending, which is largely current spending and public consumption, and how it can affect the growth. Barrow looked at that in 1990 about the assumption of security spending as productive. He assumed security spending as being productive in developed countries, and there's subsequent analysis that came after that. Devarajani in 1996 talked about the impact of public spending on growth in developing countries, and emphasized on the importance of public consumption, but did not look particularly on security. Then we have another aspect which relates now to the energy transition and the importance of energy transformation. It's about the negative impact of higher political risk and fragility on the exploration and exploitation of green minerals needed for the energy transformation, and on the size of gas fields, gas being a low carbon fuel needed for the energy transition. And this is important because many of these fragile countries can be potential producers of those green minerals and of gas. Next. So the first lesson we have, for instance, from the DRC public expenditure review, it's the interaction between term of trade shocks, violence, and GDP. So we see that a term of trade shock stimulates both growth and violence. And here we're talking about the positive term of trade shocks, essentially the increase of the price of minerals. And as expected, while growth reduces violence, violence reduces growth. So you have a kind of vicious circle that sets in motion here. And those charts try to capture it. So we see here how a term of trade shock increases violence, and how it increases also GDP, but then in turn, violence decreases GDP, while higher GDP might reduce violence. So you have all these interactions that makes fragility, violence, and term of trade shocks endogenous. Now, moving to the next slide, we see what can be the impact of security spending. And here we used a model, DIGNAR and DIG-labor models. And as I mentioned earlier, Barrow assumed that security spending, that is largely current spending and public consumption, can be a productive spending. So we tried the DIGNAR model, and we showed that a positive shock on mining prices increases output as well as deforestation, because the key energy used in DRC is biomass. So when they have growth, they use more energy, but the essential energy there is biomass. There's more deforestation. But then violence also rises, so as we've seen previously, and reduces the growth. We then find that higher security spending would dampen violence and stimulate output, but deforestation increases further because of the energy mix in DRC, which is tilted toward biomass. Next. So we looked a little bit here on how public spending and the different components of public spending can affect the growth for a full sample of 115 countries over 60 years, and for high income, low middle income, low income, and fragile countries. So what is important here is that whatever the type of estimation we use, whether elasticities, implied long-run multipliers, or calculated long-run multipliers, we see that public investment has a positive impact on growth. Also, whatever is the approach, we see that in high-income countries, government consumption doesn't have a significant impact on growth. And in the case of the long-run multiplier, it also has a negative impact. For the low middle income and low income countries, I mean, the results are somewhere in the middle. So we have, in some places, we have clearly positive impact of government consumption and public investment on growth. In other estimation, it's not clear cut. And for fragile countries, we see that government consumption can have some positive impact on growth. So basically, these results are somewhere between Barrow and Devarajani, all saying that yes, public consumption might have a positive impact, and this component of public consumption that might relate to security may have a positive impact on growth, especially in low middle income countries and low income countries and FCVs. Next. Now, regarding the interaction between political risk, fragility, and access to green minerals. So here we see that political risk leads to expectations of very high revenues before mineral exploration, meaning that to go into highly risky country, a country with high political risk, the investor has to anticipate high revenues. And we see here a chart between the doing business and the percentage of copper in the rock. And you can see that the lower is the doing business, the higher is the required percentage of copper in the rock for the investor. For instance, for DRC, you don't see investors where you have less than 1% of copper in the rock, while in Chile, you can go as low as 0.1, 0.2. So this means that for these countries where you have a high potential, a large part of the mineral that is critical for the energy transition will remain in the ground because of the political risk and the fragility. Next. Here, we develop further on the same subject, and we see that actually in the table that the quality of infrastructure, that is the upper part, and the political risk actually correlate and correlate strongly. It's rare that you find a country with a high quality of infrastructure at the same time a very low level of political risk, whatever is the type of measure you take for the political risk. And now we have the chart shows over 25 years how explorations in DRC, Chile, and Zambia evolved with the copper price, where we see that systematically Chile is above DRC and Zambia, although DRC and Zambia have a very high potential in copper. And actually, we don't have that in this presentation, but we found that over those 25 years, Chile attracted $11 billion in exploration, just exploration. We're not talking yet about the investment in copper. And all these explorations were from 0.2% concentrate to above. In DRC and Zambia, the two countries together attracted $4 billion over 25 years. In DRC, we don't find any exploration below 1%. In Zambia, we don't find any exploration below 0.5%. So all the potential below 1% and below 0.5% in this country remains in the ground, and it is a loss for the energy transition and for the country because these are potential revenues that remain in the ground. Next. Moving to gas. Here we use the rule of law as being the principal component of governance indicator and the political risk indicators, because it shows very high correlation between the other components of the world governance indicators. And it's interesting to see that both for offshore and onshore fields of gas, the higher the political risk, meaning the lower is the rule of law, -2, the higher the political risk, the bigger has to be the size of the gas field. Meaning that in high-risk countries, marginal fields or lower size fields that economically are viable become non-viable and are lost also for the energy transition and for the countries as source of revenue. Here's the conclusion. So the main findings are there's an important endogeneity between violence and economic and development trends. Second, there's a role for security spending, and security spending can help mitigate the impact of violence on growth and development. And third, the importance of de-risking investments in green minerals and low carbon gas to maximize both their production for energy transition and transformation, and to maximize revenues for the poorest and the most fragile host countries or resource countries. Finally, these are the 5 ASAs or papers covered in this presentations. Some of the colleagues might be connected or in the room, so and they might help me answering some questions related to details of the analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shadi. This was great. And I think, you also touch upon a few topics that we heard this morning from the Prime Minister of Chad and the Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia. The whole point about, guess what, security spending is important. How do you take that into account in terms of trade-off for government? And also, obviously, the whole private sector perspective, we didn't talk too much about it, but how important it's being factor. For me, it is factor, but you see the gap at which, and the impact, it shows that the MEGA, IFC obviously a role to play, including in fragile and conflict-affected states as it's being done. So now, thank you, Aliona, thank you, Shadi. Let me turn first to Shanta. I'm wondering why there was no mic for Shanta. Let's make sure Shanta has a voice. And two questions for you. One, why do you think those papers are important? What does it mean? But also, you remember the fact that there is a clear link about remaining engaged for international finance institutions. What does that tell you? And how do you see the most effective way to engage from the IFI perspective? Thank you again, Shanta, for being with us today.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for those presentations. It's a pleasure to be here and be with former colleagues and friends, and including some of my students who came here to Fragility Forum. Yes, no, I think there are two reasons why I think these two sets of presentations and the papers underlying them are incredibly important. One is that they're very well done technical studies, and it's important to have that rigor when we do the analysis. But the second is that they were all written by staff of the World Bank and the IMF. So the question that I want to treat is, given that the staff, the economists at the fund and the bank are drawing these conclusions, these findings from rigorous empirical research, what does this imply for how the World Bank and the IMF should engage? And I want to say, I'm going to say some inconvenient truths, but I want to say I really feel this is important because we are currently facing a major crisis in the Sahel. The entire Sahel is blowing up, literally and figuratively. Not to mention the persistence and grinding poverty that the region has faced with high population growth, climate change, and everything else. And now you have basically terrorist groups running around the whole place, not to mention the Wagner group and others, really debilitating the population. The second context I want to talk about is resource-rich countries that Shadi was referring to, because we've also have a history of poor, weak governance in resource-rich countries. That's absolutely clear. And the work on DRC exemplifies that. Now, the reason why this is relevant is that it seems to me, and I mean, Alona has mentioned that it's important to engage, the benefits of engaging, the fund engaging with these countries. But clearly, we have to do better if we're faced with these situations like the Sahel and this persistence of resource-rich bad governance in resource-rich countries. And by the way, the bad governance is one of their structural characteristics for predicting fragility. So then I thought about it, and I discussed it with some friends at the IMF who sort of then gave the usual IMF answer. Oh yeah, well, we've been engaging, we've got a new strategy and we have more engagement, and World Bank, I'm sure, will say the same thing. And this is the point. We engage by engaging with the government. Our definition of engagement is we're talking to the government. Now, if you accept that the problem is weak governance, the problem is that government that you're talking to. Right? How do you expect a government that is corrupt, that is stealing from its own people, to actually listen to you? What we don't engage with is the public, is the people. Now, again, the defensive argument is, oh yeah, we've held consultations with our country CPF, what's it called, country partnership framework, and so on. But it's always an afterthought. Right? It's the second thing we do. I think we need to flip that. We should be engaging with the public first, and only after that should we engage with the government. Because it's the public whom we're trying to serve. The governments will come and go, and with coups they go and come. But the people are still there, and they're the ones who are facing the brunt of the difficulties. And let me just be very concrete about how we might want to engage. One is being able to disseminate our analytical work. This is something I was trying to do when I was chief economist in MENA. Disseminate our analytical work to the public, and do it even if the government doesn't want you to do it. In fact, especially if the government doesn't want you to do it, right? Because that's the sign of bad governance. I mean, I'll be very honest. When we did this work on crony capitalism in Tunisia in 2000, it was first done around 2008 or 7 or 8, and Ben Ali, the president of the country, basically told the country director, "You publish this report, and you can kiss your country office goodbye. The program is over." So guess what the country director did? He didn't publish the report, right? 2 years later, Ben Ali was kicked out. And then, of course, we published the paper. But we, I think, did a disservice to the Tunisian people by not letting them know that we had all of this evidence about things that they were talking about, but they didn't have the evidence that we can actually help. So this has to be something central. Now, then the third area of engagement is this management of mineral resources. Because there's a fundamental problem with mineral resources, which is that the money goes directly to the government without passing through the hands of the people. That gives government enormous ability to abuse those resources. And they do. That's what we see. That's what we see in DR Congo. That's what we see in Gabon. So let me give you, since you're the mission chief for Gabon. So we've done some research again, this is about 10 years ago, again, bank staff doing this research, where we asked a question for the mineral-rich countries in Africa. You can take a portion of their mineral resources, and by the way, these are mineral-rich countries, very rich countries, middle income, sometimes high income countries with very high levels of poverty, of extreme poverty. Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, and so on. So we asked, suppose you take a portion of those mineral resources and distribute it equally to the entire population. What percentage will be enough to eliminate extreme poverty in that country? Eliminate, zero, right? Anyone want to guess what the figure is for Gabon? What percentage of Gabon's resources? 6%. Just take 6% of Gabon's mineral resources and give it out as cash transfers to the whole population. That's it, zero poverty rate. And that 6% you can do every year. I mean, it's not a big number. It's a little higher for the high population countries like Nigeria, but for Gabon, this is something we can do. Now, we wrote this paper, we presented it all over the place. Huge resistance from World Bank management, huge resistance from the governments in the countries, obviously. But this is something we have to be doing. Otherwise, it's going to deteriorate even further. And that's the key. And that's the key to DR Congo. Do I have 1 minute more? Yeah. So then, finally, I have lots more things to say, but finally, there's something in Aliana's paper, which I think is very important, which she didn't mention in the presentation, which is the engagement after the coup. Because the other thing you see, there are some beautiful charts in the paper about all these factors that were deteriorating before the coup, like GDP growth, like inflation, and so on, get worse after the coup. And in fact, they continue to deteriorate for about 4 years, I think 4 or 5 years, before they even turn around, let alone achieve the pre-coup levels. So these countries that have just had coups are in an extremely dangerous place. The possibility of a second coup, if you take their results about predictors of coups, is extremely high. What does the World Bank do when there's a coup? OP 7.30 says you disengage. Just when they need support, when the people of that country need support, we say, oh, it's what is it called? An illegitimate government or something like that. So we disengage. So we have to change that. And I said, it's not me saying it, it's your staff that are saying it. You just listen to your staff and try to take it from there. Let me stop there before I get more outrageous.
Thank you, Chantal. A lot of applauding. I guess it's not only your students, but well, let me now shift actually to Elizabeth. So you really spoke, Chantal, in terms of from the IFI perspective and remaining engaged. What does it mean? With whom? And we're going to be especially careful mentioning the whole point about the curse, if I may say, and all the mining resource. Elizabeth, obviously on the UN front, totally different picture, focusing on mediation, focusing as well on peace building. You are the key person in charge of that at the UN. How do you see your role, how effective it has been in terms of help preventing instability to go to the sky? How do you see the role and what do you take from those papers reflecting on the engagement from the UN perspective? Thank you.
No, thank you so much. And I'm very appreciative of the invitation, Frank. And I have to say, this is a very healthy discussion so far. I have a hard act to follow, but I think the fact that we're discussing these things with the candor that is being expressed and with some really good empirical information in the IMF/World Bank space is absolutely to be commended. And I hope that we're going to see more of this and that the consequence of this will be reform and change in the way that we all do business, because clearly something's got to give, as they say. So really very salutary, and I salute you, Frank, and the whole panel for this. Well, look, that's right. We're coming in from a somewhat different perspective, I suppose, although not entirely different. I mean, everything that I saw in the studies, which are fascinating, really, just reinforce our vision and approach to fragile, conflict-affected contexts. And that is first and foremost that you do need a comprehensive approach. And when I say a comprehensive approach, that's from the point of view of the UN and all of its tools, but also all of our other partners, including the IFIs. So we're all really in this together. And how can we sort of positively affect situations on the ground through our tools, our peace building tools and our political mediation tools? Well, first of all, in terms of peace building, a lot of the work that we do in peace building is really all about addressing the root causes of conflict and fragility. And I think, again, the studies have really very, very well laid out the various stressors and issues, whether they are structural problems or more tangential stressors and so forth. And we are working within that space with the tools that we have across the humanitarian development and peace tools that we have, always with the human rights lens. And we haven't mentioned human rights yet in this discussion, so I think I need to put that on my little round table here. And if we go back to what we actually quote quite a bit in the UN still today, the joint UN World Bank Pathways for Peace report of 2018. So that's already 6 years ago. And Frank, when you were at the World Bank, you were absolutely instrumental in the development of that report. We were talking very clearly about the need for a pivot to prevention and the fact that we needed to really look at how we address inequalities and exclusion of different types, political, economic, social, and so forth, because these are often at the root of conflicts, of instabilities. So in a peace-building approach, we try to address those root causes. And how do we do that? I mean, it can take a number of different forms. We can help to address structural inequalities, for example, looking at expanding opportunities for vulnerable groups, equitable service delivery, can be many different things. We can help to strengthen the institutions that will help address various grievances in a society. So rule of law was mentioned, so justice systems, so forth. We can also, through peace building, promote inclusive dialogues on contentious issues. So land reform, natural resources management, other issues within a society that build tensions and can lead to conflict. And in terms of sustaining momentum for reforms, inclusive dialogue can be extremely important. So that you're talking about, how do you sustain momentum for reforms, for economic reforms, macroeconomic reforms? Well, if you're going to have just a dialogue with the top dogs, and this was mentioned just a moment ago, and you're not explaining to the society what those reforms are and what impact they will have, and hopefully also how you might mitigate the negative impact of those reforms, you are going to be causing potentially instability rather than improving things on the ground. So through peace building, the support of inclusive dialogues, whether it's a national level dialogue, whether it's community level dialogues, that can even be used in terms of how you bring about or try to bring about certain macroeconomic reforms. Now, in terms of political mediation, that we also work on, and this is where I know the bank is not involved and doesn't want to get involved. It's not part of your mandate. That's also very important in these contexts of political instability or political crisis, because as someone in an earlier panel that I was moderating said, well, political instability, coups, unconstitutional changes of government of various types, those are first and foremost political problems, so they need political solutions. So you have to have some sort of negotiation. You have to try to arrive at some basic agreement, because that's going to give you a baseline for going forward. But again, that's not necessarily going to address the broader picture of why this happened in the first place. That takes us back to the root causes. But this can already help us on the path to changing things, if indeed we can get the parties to agree. And here, where again the issue of who the parties are is so important, because the more inclusive you have a mediation or a political process to solve a political issue, the better the chances are that this will be sustainable. So we do have these tools, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I think let's go back. Something very important is, let's go back to this issue of staying engaged. That is absolutely critical. And I would add something to that, and that's staying engaged for the long term. The problem is that the international community often has a very short attention span. So we may, put a package of or a ton of political attention and resources in one particular area. I know there's a lot of concern over Ukraine, Middle East, what's happening there. Everything seems to be shifting in that direction. And we often take our eyes off the ball of other contexts. And I've always said in my role as ASG for Peacebuilding Support at the UN, that one of the most important things I can do is to try to keep the spotlight on all of the other fragile and conflict-affected contexts around the world, for which there is less and less attention, because as we've seen very clearly, once you're in that very fragile space with various interlocking and interacting either structural or conjectural stressors, you're not going to get out of it easily. And in fact, if not attended to, they tend to get worse. As you were saying, you have one coup, there's nothing stopping you from having a second or a third coup, and that's usually what ends up happening. So I think we have to stay engaged, but we have to stay engaged smartly. We have to change the way we do business in many cases. And I think, again, as you were saying, for the banks, there's perhaps some soul searching there. So macroeconomic reforms that you see might be important in a particular country, they need to be conflict sensitive macroeconomic reforms, because if not, they can, as I said a moment ago, perhaps create more problems at the end of the day, political instability, social unrest, and so forth, than anything that they might be able to solve. We have to be more preventive again. We have to invest more in prevention, as Pathways for Peace said, and our Secretary General repeated once again in a new agenda for peace in his policy brief of just last year. I found it very interesting, for example, that the study, Eliana's study, was talking about predicting coups, and that actually we can predict coups. And I'm actually not surprised about that, because we more or less know the patterns. Of course, they're not always they're certainly not linear. They're not always the same, but there's quite a bit of pattern to it. The problem is we do have early warning. What we're particularly bad at is early action. And we have to get to that. We have to both invest more in what some of us call structural prevention. So again, dealing with the root causes, and also try to get in preventive diplomacy and other political tools as early as possible to try to help out. So I would just make a plea that let us not have a them and us, the banks and the UN types doing different stuff. We do have some different tools, but really we're all in this together, and we need to find a way to bring those tools together to do our joint analysis, to be very clear on the root causes, on the drivers of fragility and conflict, and how we can help to tackle those together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is excellent. I think the whole point about prevention, we heard it big time. Prevention, which is also about inclusive growth and making sure that development is there before the crisis, before it's too late. Second point about making sure that we again focus on the root cause of fragility. drivers of fragility. Otherwise, financing by itself may not actually be the solution. And last but not least, the whole point about the comprehensive approach, that doesn't mean that institutions are changing their mandate. That means that they are humble enough to look at the other expertise to ensure that at the end of the day, different focus on peace, security, humanitarian development, political affairs adds up to something which is coherent. So this was excellent. I'm turning to our colleague to see if we have any question online. No, so maybe in the room, we're quite late, but let's take at least 2-3 questions. I see on the first row. So I will ask you, I guess there is a mic, which is, there is someone already took the position there. So you know what? I am the one who didn't see there was a mic here. So you are going to start because you were already aligned. So that's the rule of law. And you please introduce yourself and ask the question. And then if you don't mind positioning yourself. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jean Mayer. I have been researching international economics for quite a while and environmental issues. I don't know if this will be addressed in this form or in another form, but I know that the head of the World Bank, who's been there not quite a year yet, on a number of online forums that I've watched him at, has brought up the issue of exchange rates and exchange rates being problematic for development and developing countries. And this gets into the international economics beyond just the macroeconomics of a domestic country. But I'm curious about how spillovers from the global economy create problems for domestic economies and undermine their financial stability and their economic stability. I mean, I'm just reading this morning about Nigeria, right? One of the biggest economies in Africa. It just raised its interest rates 400 basis points. I mean, that just seems like to say the Naira, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's been struggling with the Naira for quite a while this last year. And, that's going to kind of like be quite, present a lot of austerity, I think, for Nigeria. And, I don't know what Jay Powell would do if we had 400 basis points increase in interest rates in this country. I think we'd have people fighting in the streets. But can you address any of that? Thank you very much.
Sure, we'd be happy to have Aliona and Shadi addressing that. Thank you. Next, please.
Gillian Sheehan. I'm with UN with the Peace Building Support Office. I'm not an economist, so I'll preface this by thanking the panel very much for making this clear also to those of us who are reaching beyond our comfort zone. I wanted to direct a quick question to Aliona because this was an absolutely fascinating presentation for us coming from the political side of the house. You identified 25 countries that your machine model told you were at risk, and of those 9 actually suffered coups. What happened to the others? Was it possible in your format to tell the difference? Were there other factors that helped you understand why those 9 and not the rest? And what do you take away from that in terms of policy prescriptions? Thanks.
Great, thank you. Next one.
Thank you. My name is Catherine Nwajaku Dahu. I'm the director of the Politics and Governance Program at ODI. And she stole my question. But I have another question. And it was, I found your presentation fascinating. It's entitled Political Fragility. And the question in my mind was really about how far we've come really in understanding the drivers of fragility in terms of the contexts that we focus on. So we all know, working on fragility, that context is everything and no one fragile context is like another. And it seems that kind of absent from the conversation was a real engagement with context, the context of statehood in those countries. We were talking about reforms and growth rates and so on. But in the back of my mind, there was just a question about what entities are we talking about? How viable have these states been? And whether there really is a big distinction between those in which one can predict the emergence of a coup and the others. So I just wanted some of your thoughts on that, the existence, the nature of statehood in the context that we're talking about, and how we actually really also might wish to think or unpack that a little bit to adjust the expectations we have that would be fragile context. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, please. And that will be the last question
Thank you.
for the room. And then we'll turn, actually, there's one question online.
My name is Simon Hongwa, an economist. Oh, well, my question is more like a hybrid question comment. And it comes from, I think we are, as economists, we are falling into a trap, a fallacy trap of always thinking cool, bad, cool, illegitimate, and the alternative or the opposite, which is electoral, democracy, electoral elections, good. But if we listen to the lesson this morning, and we found out that the best laid plans, the best dreams a society can have will not materialize without a strong state. And by strong state, I mean a government that has monopoly over the powers of coercion and violence. Without that, and this means maybe a coup tell us something else. That a coup is not just a coup from a constitutional standpoint, but it's one of possible outcomes. For example, it's an alternative to civil war. Having a coup means, at the very least, the military, the varied factions of the military are united, at the very least. And that's a starting point. That means you have some unity there. And if we look in the past, historically, really, countries have been ruled by military figures, military-like figures. Remember George Washington? Yeah, he might have been elected a civilian, but he built his popularity, his strength, his persona, all these things as a military leader. So I'm not condoning coups and I'm not disparaging electoral democracy. I'm just saying if we just looked at this aspect, because a coup can be more legitimate than an electoral election, an electoral government at some point. And that's what we're seeing in the Sahel right now. I mean, those coups are people are supporting those coups. That was not supposed to happen if we're looking at the coup as a constitutional issue. And another thing is if the Constitution prohibits coups, but at the same time doesn't deliver on what's supposed to deliver to discourage coups, it's useless for the public. So anyway,
Thank you.
thank you.
We'll come back to the legitimacy of coup, and I will ask Shanta actually to chime in and share his views on this one. Let's go for the question online, please. And I
So
will
we
turn
have a
to
great-
each of the panelists after.
We have a great engagement online, so it's very nice to see that a lot of colleagues worldwide are connected. We have an interesting question on AI and emerging technologies, and the extent to which there are any opportunities or challenges you could talk to on, in particular, AI and how we could use that in prevention and early action.
All right. Thank you very much. So let's go. If maybe the best is actually for all the panelists, some questions were more targeted to a specific person, but if you could just answer, starting with Aliona, Shanta, Elizabeth, and then with Charlie, you will finish on your end. I mean, obviously there are a few questions for Aliona, but please feel free to chime in even if it's not really an area. And Aliona, please.
It's on, I guess. Okay. Well, thanks very much for the questions. I'm not going to answer the questions about the economic spillovers per se, but just to say in terms of the work that we did look at spillovers, and the spillovers that I mentioned, particularly the spillovers of political uncertainty, political insecurity in the neighboring countries. And that does come up as an important driver behind some of the coups. Obviously, we had, I think, about 80, if I recall correctly, the number, about 80% of the coups occurring kind of like in a context of neighboring countries having coups, and the spillovers are obviously strong in some countries where neighbors do have coups, as we've seen in Sahel, and not in the others. So spillovers are important. On the countries that were predicted to have coups, I wish we could show the names of the countries, but it would be kind of like politically incorrect on our side, too sensitive on our side to show them. But that is to say that, we looked at the drivers in the sense of trying to understand what is kind of like, what are the root causes of the coups. Triggers are a little bit more difficult. So I would say I don't think there's a big difference between the countries necessarily that had coups and those that did not have coups. Many of them were very close to a situation where they could have had coups, but it's probably many times it's an issue of trigger. Is there something that kind of like pushes, let's say, maybe kind of like the benefits of a coup over and triggers? It's very hard. Those are very hard to predict. So we did not go into that. And on the issue kind of like of statehood and those countries, I will only say kind of like two things. One is that I did not mention kind of how we see fragility per se, but it was in one of the slides that for us, we distinguish between two types of fragility. One is what we call chronic fragility, which is the inability to generate growth. But the other one is fragility to stress. And they're kind of like breakdowns in the economic and political systems. Obviously, so coups were kind of like part of the political fragility to stress. But these are issues when grievances cannot be solved by constitutional means. So political fragility to stress are usually these kind of like breakdowns happen either through coups, irregular changes in government, unconstitutional, so to speak, or internal conflicts. So overall, kind of like countries that have institutions that cannot resolve grievances, let's put it this way, by constitutional means, they would be in situations that are more prone to coups. And the other factor that goes to talk about statehood is that in predicting coups, countries that are predicted to have a high probability of coups are usually predicted based on these institutional weaknesses, structural weaknesses. We do have a time dimension which comes through these conjunctural factors. Time dimension does not help much. So most countries that have been predicted to have high probability of coups are in a weak institutional and structural statehood environment, if you wish to say. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's just turn to Shadi before Shanta and Elizabeth. Shadi, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. So I'll try to first talk about the spillover. Yes, spillover is there. I mean, it's the heart of the question. I mean, when we say that a term of trade shock leads to higher violence, this is a spillover. I mean, this is coming from the international economy. It's higher demand for minerals that increases the prices for mineral. That leads to a voracity effect, where you have competing actors that rush to capture the rent. And we're seeing it now in Eastern DRC. And actually what happened last week when the EU signed a contract with Rwanda for the export of coltan, I mean, it triggered riots in Kinshasa, riots against the EU embassies and the diplomatic representation. So why? Because it was seen as a vector of instability in the East. And it triggered this effect of competition and voracity over minerals. In the specific case of Nigeria, I don't have the details, but it looks like a typical case of capital flight that is being countered through an increase in interest rates. And the recent I learned about Nigeria is that now they are imposing even current account restrictions, the balance of payments. Now, why is it happening? It might be related to some debt repayments. It might be related to some issues in the oil market for Nigeria. I don't know, but yes, this is the key symptom of a capital flight. Now, the nature of statehood, absolutely. I mean, when we see a weakening of the key functions of the state, whether the economic functions, whether the social functions, whether the security functions, yes, this leads to what we are seeing. This leads to fragmentation within the society. This leads to the society being more prone to violence and to dissensions, and we're seeing it in Africa and elsewhere. We see that when the ingredients of the social contract that is in place are no more sustainable, we see that things turn wrong. And this can be a social contract about redistribution of oil rent. Well, if the oil prices decline and stay low for a long time, the social contract is broken because there's nothing to redistribute. And sometimes those who are on the top are not willing to put their hands in their pockets and to pay the taxes to continue with the services they were providing previously through oil rent. Regarding the strong state and the coup, yeah, no one wants to do the apology of the coup, but again, we're back to the social contract. Yes, the South Korean adventure started with a coup. In 1962, it was a coup that started the South Korean takeoff, and the champion of the coup remained in power until 1979. But it's not just about the coup, it's about the social contract that was in place. What was given to the population and what was taken from the elite, and within which context. Regarding the artificial intelligence and prevention, this is an interesting question. I mean, I never thought about it, but I think it gives food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shadi. Shanta, please.
I know we're running out of time, but I want to respond to a couple of the questions. Actually, to pick up on Catherine's question, it is really, you're absolutely right. This whole situation is calling into question the nature of the state. And in a slightly different way from what Shadi was saying, it also means that maybe it's the region rather than the individual states that should be the focus of our attention. Look at the Sahel. It actually doesn't matter whether you're in Niger or Mali or Burkina, you're in a bad place in all of those. Frank and I had this struggle with the Mashrek region in Middle East because you had ISIS running all over those countries. They didn't care about which country they were in, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and others. And yet, and coming back to my point earlier, the World Bank and the IMF have a country-based model. There's a country director who goes in and tries to say, what's the best thing for this country? Maybe sometimes the best thing for this country is to do something else in another country so that this country can have peace. Because we know that there are spillovers. And I think that comes back to Shadi's point about security spending. We take this view on security spending in terms of whether it's going to benefit the country. But if you believe that fragility can spread across neighbors, as it does, then maybe the security spending by one country can benefit neighbors as well. And we have to take a very different approach to security spending than we do normally. I think it's closer to what we're discussing in other fora about global public goods. Peace is a global public good. And if we start taking that into account, we may have a very different approach to peace building. And then the question about, you asked me to answer the question about coups versus strong states, which is a very, very good question. I think in all of these discussions, we should avoid dichotomies. It's not like coups are illegitimate and democracies are legitimate, or the other way around, right? The world is a continuum. There are degrees of government effectiveness that vary across different types of regimes. And that's why I think this OP 7.30 is really should be revised. That's my polite way of saying it. Because it literally is a dichotomy. It says, yesterday, this was a legitimate government. Today, it's not. And we know that that's not the way the world is going to work. And we know that that shouldn't be the basis of our assistance and our engagement strategy. Because for the poor woman in the village, really nothing has changed. And that's whom we should be serving. So I fully agree with you. Now, the one statement I would question, though, is whether a coup means that the military is united, because I've seen many cases where, especially when they're the junior officers from the military who launch the coup against the senior officers. This happened in a few West African countries, which we shall not mention, and other places. So let's keep that in mind. The other thing is the military sometimes exerts influence without launching a coup. And the recent experience that is still evolving in Pakistan might be an indicator.
Thank you, Shanta. Talking about military, Elizabeth, over to you. I don't know, which question do you want to address?
Well, okay. Since you mentioned military, let me start with a little point on security spending. I thought that was quite interesting from the study, if I understood it well, that the idea being that in some of these countries, including the poorer countries, security spending can be good as part of public spending, and I wouldn't refute that, but I would say it really all depends also on the percentage of public spending that's going to the security sector, because if it is taking away massively from what would otherwise be channeled into social spending or some other aspect of public expenditure, again, that could cause more problems than it resolves. So I think it's not a black or white. It's not security spending is good or bad, but among other things, what percentage of public expenditure does that represent in these poor countries that often have very spotty basic service delivery and so forth? And to me, it just also, again, calls for the comprehensive approach, which we were talking about. So when we look at the Sahel, for example, we sometimes worry that there might be sort of an over-securitized approach. Everything's about security, everything's about the jihadists and so forth. Of course, that's extremely important. You can't even deliver humanitarian aid or development, for that matter, et cetera, in places that are so violent and volatile, you can't even get in there. I mean, security is key, but if that's the only thing that you're working on and you're not trying to work on other areas in parallel where you're able to do so, again, you're going to be spinning your wheels. So we need the comprehensive approach, and not just wait until the security is entirely to our satisfaction. Very quickly on this good coups, bad coups, and so forth. I think we don't want to entertain that too much. Suffice it to say that as you were suggesting, a lot of these coup leaders came in saying, well, the prior government was useless. Look at all these jihadists overrunning the country. We're going to fix this. Well, several years later, they have not fixed it. And as you were saying, the study also underscored, things are much worse. So I don't think that this is a prescription or a panacea. I think it's more a reflection of and where we should be looking is the governments that didn't deliver prior to these occurrences, and we need to see how we can help those countries, those governments deliver and deliver equitably, and also to support civil society so that there can be accountability of those governments. In terms, very quickly, final point on the AI question, I have to say that this is this issue of the role of AI more broadly, but including in peace and security, is something we're talking about increasingly at the United Nations, and we're sort of trying to take it as an issue that we need to work on very quickly, so that we're at least a bit ahead of the curve. But I'm afraid we're probably already massively behind the curve on AI. I mean, I think every day it seems that the Chat GPT and all of these other AI instruments out there are getting faster, are getting more sophisticated, and we're still trying to figure things out. But the topic of this forum this year is adapting and innovating in a volatile world. So clearly, we have to look at AI as a tool that can help us to adapt and innovate, including in terms of prevention and early action. And I'm sure there are many ways that that can be done. But we're also looking at the reverse, or the other side of the coin, and that is how do we prevent AI from deepening what we see in many countries now, which can cause a lot of instability and tension, especially in electoral context, but not only, which is misinformation, disinformation, deep fakes, and so forth. So we have to look, I think, at the positive side of AI and how it can help us to build and sustain peace, and also preventively how we counter its negative influences. And for that matter, modern technology more broadly, we're also looking at, okay, what about this issue of autonomous weapons? So definitely this is an issue of the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So I will not try to conclude, because I don't think there was actually a key conclusion. I would be curious to know from ChatGPT, if we are going to ask, can you do a summary of this session? What would be the key conclusion? I'm sure there will be the Shanta views about fundamentally rechanging the mandate and the engagement of some institution. You will have at least one key point that I saw across the panel, which is to say remaining engaged is important. Now the question is more how, with whom? And the two last points were obviously, and we keep on saying it, it's a buzzword, but very important for institution, even if you don't change any mandate, to really kind of explore ways to enhance the partnership with other organizations with totally different mandate, organizations that do not talk to each other. I do think that actually has been progress if you look over the past 10 years. I'm not so sure 10 years ago that you will have peace, security, humanitarian actors, development, financial institutions talking at the country level the way they talk today. So I do think there has been some progress. And I think the whole point of the session is really to explore what's next. Very last point is about the importance of analytics. Shanta used to say it when he was at the bank. I'm happy to hear for all his students that he keeps on repeating it today. We had two fantastic papers. Just want to let you know that I know from the bank, but also from the IMF over the past few years, staff have been really focusing on analytics. Actually, Aliona is a co-author of a paper recently finalized on the link with climate change, fragile conflict affected states, and you have so many other papers at the IMF that have been produced. I invite you to look at the website dedicated to fragile and conflict states, because this is actually very important. And I really encourage all the staff of institutions to continue on that path. Many thanks for all colleagues being here and participants, including colleagues and participants online. Much appreciated the support that we have received from the World Bank. I think this is a fascinating forum where you have different views, but that's exactly what makes it extremely important. Thank you all.